Alright, so despite the fact that you might hear people ask or talk about how they can speak Chinese often enough, nobody can actually speak the Chinese language because it doesn't exist. Chinese is the designation we give to a dialect continuum spoken throughout eastern and central China. A dialect continuum is a large group of dialects or languages, the difference isn't actually too clear, in which those in proximity to one another are similar, but as you move farther and farther away, the dialects become continually more divergent, in many cases reaching the point of being separate languages. There are many dialect continuums found all around the world, including the Sami languages of Finland and Russia, as well as the German continuum that contains English, Dutch, German, and several others. However, the Chinese continuum is one of the biggest because, I don't know if you ever noticed, but China's kind of a big place. In fact, the Chinese continuum has several recognized separate languages. Here's a map. There are three major classification groups for dialects, though it's important to understand that there is a ton of overlap between them, and being in one group has no effect on being in any of the others. The names are Abstandssprache, Aussprache, and Dachsprache. Abstandssprache actually describes the relationship between two dialects and really just means two dialects that aren't mutually intelligible. What's mutual intelligibility, you ask? It's when two different dialects or forms of speech can be understood by someone who only understands one. For example, if you speak Cockney English, it's probable you can understand most of what I'm saying right now. Mutual intelligibility is also measured in percentage sometimes, like Ukrainian is 70% intelligible with Russian. Back to Abstandssprache. They're unintelligible, often due to a breakdown. An example of this dialect is Standard and Egyptian Arabic, which are abstinent from each other. The next type, Aussprache, describes a dialect or language with independent cultural status, often with its own standardized form independent from the neighboring languages. Sometimes these are created in the process of nation building. A good example of this is Ye, Chinese language that is completely unintelligible with Mandarin and has its own dialects, one of which, Cantonese, is really freaking famous even if you hadn't realized it, and is the prestige dialect. All those famous Chinese people, Jackie Chan, Donnie Yen, Bruce Lee, and Andy Lau, all speak Cantonese originally, not Mandarin. The third type of dialect is the Dachsprache, which is the standard form of the language, like modern Standard Arabic. The sort of opposite of the Dachsprache is a pseudo-dialectized abstinent language, which is so different from the Dachsprache that it could be regarded as a separate language, though it's not recognized either culturally or politically. For example, Maithili in Hindi or Low and High German. So those are dialect classifications, but languages themselves are also classified based off of how many standard forms there are. If there is only one standard form, like in Japanese and Icelandic, the language is monocentric. If there are multiple standard forms, it is pluricentric. You may think that there probably aren't that many pluricentric languages, but French, Spanish, Arabic, Malay, Korean, and even English and Chinese are pluricentric. But speaking of Chinese, if there are many different languages, what actually unites them? Well, two things. One is writing. All of the Chinese languages use the same writing system, which has a defined vernacular and grammar, though some languages use different words for things, like mean versus Mandarin pronouns, though this is really just like trousers and pants in English dialects. The other unifying factor is the origin of the Chinese languages. They are all descended from Old Chinese, the version spoken during the Qing dynasty, and therefore all technically Chinese. However, not all the languages broke away at the same time. For example, Min became a new language in between the development from Old to Middle Chinese, while Yue became a new language after the development of Middle Chinese. I'll conclude by returning to the original point that Chinese is actually really diverse. According to one list, there are 10 languages, which in order of number of speakers are Mandarin, Wu, Yue, Min, Jin, Hakka, Gan, Hui, and Ping. However, Jin is usually considered to be a form of Mandarin, Hui a form of Wu, and Ping a form of Yue. However, each of these individual languages is highly diverse in its own right. For example, Wu is a designation based solely off of overlapping isoglossies. What's an isogloss, you ask? Well, basically, it's the geographic boundary of a particular linguistic feature, like the pronunciation of a vowel. So Wu is actually a bundle of dialects that happen to have similar features. It is divided into northern, southern, and western groups, which aren't even mutually intelligible themselves. The Language Atlas of China actually divides it into 6 groups, one of which is Taihu, spoken in the northern area of Wu land. Within Taihu, there are the following language dialects: Jinxiang, Qihai, Jianying, Zhengzhou, Wuxi, Ningbo, Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Shanghainese. Shanghainese, the language of Shanghai, contains variation within its small self, since the younger generations have been more influenced by Mandarin. Therefore, since each province and sometimes even city have its own dialect of one of the many different Sinitic languages, there is no possible way that you can speak Chinese.